you have a general idea based on these sketches what you need to do, then we move into what is referred to as wireframes. Wireframes are basically think about it as the frame of a house. It's just got the 2x4s or the 2x6s in place. It's got the trusses for the roof. It's got the floorboards. It's really just the skeletal outlines of what a website's going to look like. And it's created for the simple purpose of arranging those elements on the page to meet the user expectations for the user experience piece, thinking about those best practices, and also thinking about the content that you have and you want to use. And I love this quote when I came across it. And it simply is, website wireframes are 90% thinking or planning and just 10% drawing. So most of the time is spent figuring out where your items are going to go. Some things to consider. A wireframe is not a place to include end visuals. You are not going to be including any sort of images, colors, or fonts that you want to use. This is not the actual design. This is instead showing how the site functions and the layout of where the elements are going to go, not what they look like. It is also not just a drawing. Let's go back to this. It's 90% planning. So while the drawing may go quick, it's the planning that goes into it. So that's why it's not just this quick little piece in reality, because you should be spending a lot of time thinking about this. It is also not a place to do a rush job, because this is going to provide the framework for adding the visual elements in the next step and then when you get to coding. So the more detail and time you take on this, the better your site will be in the end. But what a wireframe should do is it should educate by clearly showing the layout, structure, and usability. In other words, it will show you where the navigation is. It will show you if there are any video or media elements. It will show you where headlines and text will go. It will show you where columns will be and divided up. Wireframes, because they are also relatively simple, allow for fairly efficient changes. They also work to improve user experience because they allow the prospective user, as well as yourself as the designer, to visualize the navigation, the location of certain elements, the options that are going to be available, and whether or not it's going to be intuitive to use. And ultimately, it makes for better content because you're now able to visualize, first of all, how much content you're going to need in the forms of text, where headlines, where you're going to need to break things up, and what types of images you're going to need to fill in these spaces. Planning is crucial. The wireframe part is, as I mentioned before, it is our blueprint. It is the framing of the house. We can't go any further without this, not effectively. It's going to help us determine how our visitors are going to interact with the site and the flow of our information and whether it makes sense or not. So we need to plan our layout and our interface, and we do this with wireframes because we can avoid the distractions of, oh, I don't like that particular font, or, oh, those colors are not what I was thinking. It allows us to just look at this blueprint before we move forward. And one of the things that we do, and this is where I said I was going to mention grids a little bit later on, is we use grids to help us develop this flow. A grid allows us to create some cohesiveness and flow because it helps us align things, to space things evenly instead of just randomly placing them on the page. And there is an important factor in selecting an appropriate grid. We are going to be using one called the 960 grid system. It is a fantastic system. The developers of this have determined that 960, as in 960 pixels, is kind of a magic number because it can be easily divided by a variety of numbers and come up with some even columns that can then form our basic grid. There is a link provided on the website, but I'm going to go out there really quick So this is the 960 grid system website. What you will be doing for our project is you're going to go to this big old download button and you're going to download a zipped file that contains all sorts of things. For example, this is where I've downloaded it. So here is my grid system. You'll see it has app plugins. So if you use Photoshop, you can actually just install a plugin. There is code in HTML. We don't care about the licenses or the logo files for this purpose. Sketch sheets. If you want to do the sketches, here is a basic look, and it's got grids. So you can print this out and do it on pencil and paper. In addition, this is where I usually make use of it, is they have tons of templates. And you can go in and find an application. As you can see, they have templates for all sorts of them. And so including like some free open source like GIMP. We haven't really talked about it, but you'll see it later in this presentation. Balsamic, it's an online wireframing tool. Photoshop, InDesign, Illustrator. And so for example, I went in and I used Illustrator to create my wireframes. So I went and found, I believe I used the 12 column grid. So they have 12, 16, and 24. 12 and 16 are the most common. This is all it looks like, but you use it as a backdrop when creating the layout of your site. So let's go take a look at their website again. They have all sorts of information about how to use the 960 grid system, and they also have these great demos of websites who are currently making use of the grid system. And you can simply click on Show Grid, and it will show you how this is using, there's 4 columns, 4 columns, 4 columns. It makes it nice and even. And then across here, we have it split. It looks like it's probably a 6 and 6. Here we have it so that it's probably an 8 and 4 on our 12 grid. So you can go and do this with almost any of these. This one looks like it's probably using a 24 grid. Oh, nope, it says 16. And 16, this one's 12. But you can see how they are using it before you even begin your own project. So let's go back to the other presentation and take a look at why we use grids. A grid should create relationships between objects. And what you're seeing right on the right-hand side of the screen is actually a wireframe that I created as part of what would be assignment 3 for the wireframes. And you can see how I've made use of these elements by having them take up like 3 columns. This goes all the way across, this goes all the way across, but then this is 6 and 6. And you can see how lined up, even though there is no horizontal grids, but it's important to make sure these things are lined up as well. And that's how that grid system helps us create relationships between our objects. It provides a base system for visual alignment. It helps create a horizontal and vertical rhythm, which will help in the flow and help create optical balance. Now, for example, remember the F and Z flows. This one uses a Z flow. So we'd start at the top, go across to this newsletter, and really kind of taking this whole piece, right? So this is our scan across, go by the banner, and then go across here. So these are our important elements. So this is where we use the grid. This is just a few examples of some other wireframes. These I just did some searching online, but it's just to give you an idea of how these get used. But you can see that there's no color. It's all just grays, and even including on my own, I've just done some grays to highlight a few things. For example, this one says overview video, and so it shows that there's a play button. It's using lorem ipsum text, that's fine. It's indicating where there is text and that there are things like our headlines, but it doesn't necessarily all have to be, like this news headline. It doesn't have to be in the actual words. Things like this, where it says logo. It's not the actual image. Clients we serve, I imagine these are going to be little images. It gives us columns and layouts. So this is why it's important to do wireframing. Here are some examples of some tools that you are free to use. I personally like to do mine using Adobe Illustrator. InDesign is another good option. Photoshop would be better than InDesign, so Adobe and Photoshop probably be the two best choices. Then we can go into Microsoft Word and PowerPoint. They can work. They are not ideal, but I know not everybody is as astute at using Illustrator, InDesign, or Photoshop. And then GIMP is another application. It's open source and it's free. It's sort of like Photoshop. It has some of those capabilities, so it's another method that you can use. And then there are some interactive options, and I will have links to these provided on the website. You are free to experiment with these. Most of them have 15 to 30-day free trials, so you can go and actually try and use them. I've used Flare Builder. I've played around with Balsamic a little bit. I still personally prefer to use just Illustrator to do this, but what they allow for in some of these other online applications is that you can actually click through and create multiple pages and make it interactive. So that's it on wireframes.